How do you perceive the geopolitical situation when it comes to the relations between Russia and the EU? We have came to a time where it's really difficult to communicate between those two great powers and to communicate issues and problems. We have talked about that there is no dialogue, or if there is a dialogue, there is not a real dialogue. So how do you perceive the situation in which we are currently right now?
Well, I will try to avoid the term geopolitics and geopolitical because I think it's used and abused by both sides to mean completely different things, and we can identify like people talking about good geopolitics and bad geopolitics, sort of like them doing good geopolitics and the adversary or the opponent doing bad geopolitics. So in that sense, I don't think it's a good term to sort of like use at the moment. But at the same time, EU-Russian relations are not in their like best shape, yeah? And we probably couldn't imagine that 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, it was worse. It was better, and we wouldn't sort of like expect it to get worse. But it goes on and hits sort of like a new low, yeah? And in that sense, sort of. Yeah, relations, in a way, sort of like are stopped, yeah, on both sides, and every side just like waits and see, yeah, thinking that the time is on the side, on their side, yeah, and expecting that the situation changes in such a way that they will win this confrontation. Yeah. And in the meantime, we have selective engagement, short-term things that are being sorted out, yeah, with no sort of like long-term project in between, yeah? Well, long-term project, yeah? And yeah, so and the COVID in fact didn't help the situation, yeah, in any way, yeah, because we initially sort of like saw it as a shared challenge that could probably bring some refondation, yeah, but that sort of like didn't come either, yeah. So, and then we can speculate whether the challenge was not big enough or whether relations are so tense that even a shared challenge cannot contribute to it. We now talk a lot about climate change being another challenge to sort of like help Russia and the European Union restart their relations. We will see, yeah, but there are lots of stumbling blocks, yeah, on this way. So I'm not that optimistic about it. There are some possibilities, but much depends on whether the sides will choose to exploit those possibilities for the sake of constructive engagement and for the sake of rebuilding trust, or whether sort of like more fundamental themes will predominate. And in this sense, I mean value confrontation, yeah, that exists. Russia's demand for equality with the European Union sort of like wishing to sort of, to in a way impose its way of thinking, yeah? And yeah, so this confrontation, this long-term sort of like confrontation seems to dominate at the moment. You know, we can then continue that with that confrontation comes, of course, the issue of European security, with Russia not being satisfied in the way it is managed. And then, of course, the issue of Ukraine and other territorial conflicts are linked to this European security. So everything is linked to everything in a way. And I feel that sort of that, and I think that sort of like this negative trend for the time being dominates. Although, of course, there is, yeah, just to come back, there's also understanding on both sides that there are areas for selective engagement. And if we exploit those areas of selective engagement, maybe we can start rebuilding trust between Russia and the European Union.
When we look back 30 years ago when the Soviet Union collapsed and where it seemed that Russia is not that anymore a great power, and where it became like a vacuum in Eastern Europe and in Asia, 30 years on, Russia seems to be again a great power. It finally rose up, as one would say. And it seems that the Western countries, the Western superpowers cannot deal with it, Russia being a great power, regarding Russia and looking at Russia in the same level as they look to themselves. How does this affect Russian foreign policy when it comes to negotiations, to actions in Crimea, in Ukraine, in Georgia? Are they doing this because of their own geopolitical safety, or why is this happening?
Well, if you look at the history of EU-Russian relations, Russia's relations with the West, then we will see that it started very well at the beginning of the 1990s, with Russia really wishing to rejoin Europe and rejoin the Western world. And then Russia very quickly realized that it cannot be sort of like an equal partner the way it understood the equal partnership. Although sort of like equality as such became a dominant issue much later. And then ever since, Russia has been challenging the European Union and acquiring some new bits and pieces in the relations, be it the political and security dialogue, the energy dialogue, common spaces, partnership for modernization, so on and so else. But every time, sort of like the solution that was developed did not satisfy Russia, and therefore, sort of like the challenge was preserved, and eventually we came to 2014 when the challenge became too big for the West to accommodate it in the system of relations with Russia that was set up at the beginning of the 1990s. So clearly, you cannot expect the partner who is not satisfied with the setup to respect the setup. And this is more or less what we see in Russia's relations with the West and Russia's relations with the European Union. And I think this is the problem that has to be taken into account if we want to have a sustainable long-term solution. But for the time being, many in the European Union say that there is no business as usual unless Russia changes, ignoring the fact that Russia doesn't want the business as usual the way the European Union understands it.
So if we look 10 years into the future, where can we see EU-Russia relations? Where do you see EU-Russia relations?
Well, I would say that for the coming years, we'll be stuck, we'll basically concentrate on selective engagement, on some issues where we can cooperate, be it Iran, the Middle East, maybe Syria, maybe Libya, climate change, hopefully, maybe pandemic and vaccination of African countries, for example, because this is clearly the task which requires cooperation between Russia and the West and requires coordination of all resources. And in the meantime, this sort of like longer term sort of like conceptual debate will still exist. But in the longer run, sort of much will depend on how the situation will develop in Russia and in the European Union. So what will be internal developments on both sides, and also what will be developments, global developments, because 3 years ago we couldn't imagine the situation in which we live now. So we have lots of black swans that we cannot even think about at the moment. So much will depend on how international situation will also develop. So that's probably as much of a forecast as I can give at the moment.
Thank you very much for this interview.